Yeah.
We know who he is.
Our technician wanted to know. No, we're fine, Susan. Thank you. Go. You're rolling.
I'm rolling. Oh, I didn't know it was being recorded. Okay. Well, I'm Alden Studebaker, and I'm a writer. And I've written a number of books, all very different types, as we were discussing one of them earlier. My first book is called Wisdom for a Lifetime, How to Get the Bible Off the Shelf and Into Your Hands. It's a Unity book. It was published in 1998. It's my best-selling book. It's a Bible handbook for people who don't know what to do with the Bible. Basically, to Bible novices, people who, which really for those who want to learn to do their own interpretation of the Bible. And it's sort of a step-by-step approach to that. And it's done real well. Last I checked, it sold, I think it sold a little over 12,000 copies, so that's pretty good for any kind of Bible book, I would think. And I understand they use it at our world headquarters when they're teaching ministerial students and others. So, the book I wrote right after that, in fact, one of the things that one of my colleagues said about the Bible handbook was that it read like a novel, which I thought was quite a compliment. And several months later, I was inspired. I was on a little retreat down the Ohio River. It was after Christmas. I wanted to get away from my family and my church. And the Clifty Falls State Park was having a 2-for-1 deal. Buy one night, get the second night free. It was the 1st of January, around then. I was the only one in the entire state park. So when I went to eat my lunch or dinner in the restaurant, they were all there to serve me. I'd walk in and look around and go, wonder where I should sit tonight. All I did down there was read a book. I took a novel with me. It was a novel by the British writer Helen McGuinness. It was all about Nazi gold in some lake in Austria. And the Salzburg Connection, that's what it was called. I just wanted to read something that had nothing to do with my job. So I'm reading this novel and really getting into it. And if you've ever been to that park, one of the weird kind of aspects of that park is a beautiful place, but right in front of it on the river there is an electric power plant. And you can hear it humming when you're walking around outside because you can hear all the electrical stuff going on. There was something about looking at that power plant that all of a sudden inspired me to write a book about electric power. Actually about power in general, just power on all levels, spiritual power, political power, economic power, electric power. And as I was driving along the river going back home, I live near Cincinnati, all of a sudden these ideas just started pouring out of me of a story and characters, and it's just like I had to write this book. I never wrote a novel before. I wasn't even particularly good in English when I was in school. I was always interested in the Bible, so that's what kind of got me into writing the Bible book. But so I took a stab at writing a novel. If I could go back and re-edit that book, I would love to. But it's published, and with all of its, beginner novelist problems with it. But it's a book that a lot of people enjoy reading. It has to do with it's a book of industrial espionage and a little bit of intrigue and sort of a foreign setting. Most of the activity takes place in Europe, and I wove some of my European journeys into that book. So that was The Grid. That came out in 2002, and then we were discussing earlier my poking a lot of fun at the state of Indiana. Since I left pulpit ministry a few years ago, I've had a lot of different jobs, as you can imagine. You got to eat. And one of the jobs I had was working for my brother-in-law in his home improvement business up in northern Indiana and southern part of Michigan. And I used to, of course, drive up there to get in position and go out on calls. I'd sell the stuff that goes over your gutters, keep the leaves out. I also became his service manager for a while, dealing with all the problems of installing that stuff in people's houses. I did a lot of driving around the state of Indiana, getting up there and back and then all up in the northern part. And I just started writing down some of my observations about the state. I was born in Indiana, barely. I'm from East Chicago, which most people in Indiana don't consider part of Indiana anyway. It's called The Region. The Region. If you're from the region, you're really more from Chicago than you are from like the rest of the state. But I'm technically a Hoosier, so I figure, well, I can poke fun at what I am. I would never write a book like this about Ohio or anything like that. So I had fun writing this kind of comical book called Hoosieritis, the Contagious Condition That Is Indiana. She's holding up a copy. And you see the picture of the guy hanging from the hoop with the state flag coming out of his back like that. So it's sort of an anecdotal, very anecdotal. I weave sort of family stuff into it. It's got pictures in it. It's just sort of this smart aleck, I can say smart aleck in church, smart aleck view of the Hoosier state. Every chapter has the word Hoosier in it. You know, Hoosier identity. We're talking about identity this morning, defining yourself. What's a Hoosier? So I kind of get into that. The names of places. Some really weird names of places in Indiana. You know, I start off with why is South Bend in northern Indiana? But then I say, why is North Bend, Ohio in southern Ohio? And I said, let a Buckeye explain that. Just different places that I've been in the state. I deliberately did not write about Evansville or Fort Wayne. I just couldn't come up with anything smart aleck to say about either of those places. I did devote an entire chapter to Indianapolis, which I call Hoosier Capital. And you can see I'm probably not from Indianapolis because I did make a lot of jokes about Indianapolis. It's a wonder I got invited back here. They know the book. Didn't you say once that every Hoosier child should read my book just so they understand what?
Oh, I thought it should be in the libraries and in the schools.
Yeah, I couldn't get it into the library in Dearborn County. They have all my other books, but they wouldn't take that one, probably because when I was trying to get press on that book, the only press I could get in the state of Indiana were from reporters who were not Hoosiers. Every one of them was from out of state. I checked with each one. One was from Ohio, one was from Michigan, the other one was from South Dakota or somewhere like that. Had no problem, running the press releases and stuff. But hard to get, but I could not get it from one Hoosier because I was so insulting in my book.
Some relative.
And I had one lady, I ended up on the front page of the Michigan City paper, Sunday paper, whole thing. And some lady sent me this scathing email about how I make Hoosiers look like idiots. And I almost want to write her back and say, it's obviously you had the disease, Hoosieritis, the contagious. So whatever you think's weird about the state of Indiana, it's Hoosieritis. That's all I did. I just made up his name, Hoosieritis. Hoosieritis has been used for other labels. I think there's a band or something called Hoosieritis somewhere in Indiana. It's a rock band. And I think they always use Hoosieritis to describe people who spend too much time at the Golden Corral or something. They're always eating it. I don't know. So one of the things I love about coming to Indianapolis is that you can actually go to a cafeteria, the MCL kind of thing. We don't have that in Cincinnati. So, and I did poke a lot of fun at Dearborn County where I live. I live in the most southeastern part of Indiana. So I talked about how we have the largest distillery in the world is in Lawrenceburg, Seagram's. You've heard of them. Huge place. Been there since the 1850s or something. Huge distillery. We have the largest riverboat casino. I think it's called Hollywood Casino now. It used to be called Argosy. It's like a football field long. We also have the longest ski slope in the state of Indiana. Perfect North Slopes. It's 7 miles from our house. So I basically say, you can go to the casino, waste all your money, get depressed, go buy some alcohol, get even more depressed, and do a Sonny Bono to yourself down the ski slope. But I advise against that self-destructive approach. So that's what I mean. You get a little smart aleck about stuff, and people go, "Oh yeah, it's not nice." Anyway, I was just having a little bit of fun, and
The company Kurt Vonnegut did a lot of that as well.
Yeah, and another Hoosier writer. Yeah. Anyway, I stopped working on this project here to write Hoosieritis. For some reason, I had to write. This is a little book too. It's a short read. I think each chapter is long enough to get you through a trip to the restroom. This book here is one of those that emerged out of an opening scene. where I could see the opening of the book. And let me just read it to you. I'm just going to read a little bit of the opening part. Chapter 1, page 1. The sun's rays peeked out over the horizon and streamed across the desert, setting both rabbit bush and sagebrush ablaze with the fire of Mount Sinai, as another day began in the Antelope Valley. The calm coolness of the early morning air belied the wind and heat that would soon pervade the atmosphere. Now was the ideal time to be outside for a walk, with his heart pounding from the first 100 yards and his left rotator cuff strained by the tenacious but tethered Molly. Jose Martinez quickened his steps in an attempt to keep pace with his over-eager canine. "Get back here, you stupid mutt!" Molly turned toward Jose, and then ignored her master's insulting command and galloped up the northern face of the escarpment, a hill pushed up by the enormous geophysical forces of the underlying San Andreas Fault. Jose stopped, caught his breath, and firmly reeled her in from pursuit of a bounding jackrabbit. "Hey, you, sit down, damn it, I'm in charge here." While staring back at him in defiance of his corrective measures, Molly nonetheless parked her hindquarters on the dusty trail. Jose had reluctantly accepted the Irish setter from relatives who could no longer handle her rambunctious personality within the confines of their LA apartment. The Martinez family's 4-bedroom Palmdale tract home seemed to be the logical solution to Molly's extensive need for space, as well as Jose's exercise routine. But now he questioned the wisdom of accommodating this crazy red dog. But Jose could hear his doctor's words nagging at him. "You walk that dog every day, cut back on the rich food, and you can avoid having open-heart surgery and type 2 diabetes like your brother." Well, that alone helped Jose make peace with his new pet. But he often wondered who was really walking home. Without warning, Molly was off to the races after a second jackrabbit, dragging her master further up the hill in hot pursuit. Having seen the movie Funny Farm featuring Chevy Chase and an Irish setter who always ran away, Jose knew better than to let go of the rope. He would spend hours searching in the neighborhood for her when she got loose, and once found, Molly would glance up, twitch her eyebrows as she weighed her options, and then take off running. Usually Jose would have to sneak up from behind and tackle her like a football linebacker, and then with choke chain firmly around her neck, he would lecture her all the way home about her flakish Irish setter ways. This conversation was mostly in vain, but it gave Jose the illusion of control. As they were nearing the crest of the hill in anticipation of his mountain-climbing victory, Jose slowed his pace while his lungs strained for a few more molecules of oxygen. From the summit, a good 300 feet above the valley floor, an expansive panorama unfolded, revealing the patchwork quilt of subdivisions that made up the cities of Palmdale, Lancaster, and Quartz Hill. Jose always took a moment to locate his house among the dozens in his neighborhood. However, this morning, Molly would not permit even a moment of sightseeing. She fervently kept tugging in a westerly direction with single-minded intent. Jose shook his head and muttered, "What's that idiot dog up to now?" The Molly-Jose tag team lurched sharply toward a manzanita bush off to the left of the crest trail. Molly abruptly stopped and began sniffing something lying on the ground. I always saw that early morning scene with a guy up on this hill walking his dog, and then something happened after that. I had to figure out what the other 47 and a half chapters of this book was about, just with that opening scene. I had that in my head. I wanted to write a book about geology. I wanted to write a book about earthquakes. I'd already written a book about the electrical power business. My father was a mechanical engineer, Purdue trained, worked for the United States Navy as their expert power, particularly steam-generated power engineer, until he retired 3 years ago at the very youthful age of 80. And they didn't ask him to retire either. He just decided enough already. So I like kind of writing about technical subjects. I think that's sort of the science person in me. I've always been interested in science. I think if I had not gone on to become a minister, I probably would have become a chemist, chemical engineer. I was had a real interest in that when I was in high school. So I like writing about technical things, and all of a sudden, this beginning of the story, or at least the opening scene with the sun coming up and the guy walking up the hill, is essentially me about 1987, 88, thereabouts, because we used to live in Palmdale in a tract house. It wasn't a 4-bedroom, it was a 3-bedroom. My name isn't Jose Martinez. It's Alden Studebaker. But my next-door neighbor had a 4-bedroom tract house. And his name? Ignacio Romero. I gave my dog to my next-door neighbor, gave him a different name, put him in the story. If he ever gets a hold of this book, he'll probably figure out. I haven't talked to him in a long time. So it starts off in this way with a dog, a man, kind of a normal family kind of guy. But the story is a little different than some, where you have sort of just a basic track of a narrative that's leading you from one scene to another in sort of a direct way. This book has 2 tracks. There's one track that involves the main characters, who are geologists, and one in particular is a seismologist, a hero and a heroine. I'll talk about them in a second. But there's also another track that's going on that is a criminal investigation, also involving a seismologist. I don't want to give away everything in the book, but that's something that comes pretty soon. And so these 2 tracks of the book going on, and so as you're reading the book, you are kind of going back and forth in this way between what's going on with the crime investigation and what's going on with the meat of the story, the unfolding part of the story, with the hero and the heroine. And about 2/3 or so of the way through the book, 2/3, 3/4 of the way through the book, the scenes all come together. The 2 tracks join in one scene in a very interesting place. I'm going to tell you what that place is. But it's a place that I used to spend a lot of time working in. I wonder what that is. What did he do for a living for 20-something years? Anyway. Anyway. So I've introduced to you Jose Martinez, and he has a family, and he's one of the side characters. He shows up throughout the novel as sort of like your default normal family. You know what I mean by that? You know, he's not a huge part of the drama unfolding, but just sort of like a little reality check of what a normal family would be dealing with, all along the way, and starting at the beginning and going all the way to the end. So I thought it was kind of what I did with that group of people. Then we have the geologists, and I thought, well, in California, of course, San Andreas Fault it lays over most of the state. Let's face it. And in Palmdale, there, from our house, you could see the San Andreas Fault in the backyard. You're looking right at it. I mean, it's a half mile away. Drove over it every day to work, right through a road cut where you can see the contortions of the rock like this. I even incorporated a scene of that road cut into the book. So I had to think, well, you could make all the geologists from, say, the U.S. Geological Survey, and there's a U.S. Geological Survey office in Pasadena. It's actually at Caltech. And I do bring some characters from that place into the book. Of course, they're fictional, anybody real, but they work there, a real place. But I decided to make my main character a college professor. I thought, well, why not? My last book, the main character was a power plant engineer, head of this power company, kind of the chief engineer. Why not make this guy college professor? Okay, Southern California guy, college professor. Okay, but I wanted to make him distinctive. You know what I'm saying? You can just pick any guy named, Joe Smith, and then and then all of a sudden it hit me. And, you just don't, you start off with an idea. When you're writing a book, you kind of know where you want to go with it, but you don't have it all put together. You don't have, and it's along the way you get inspired to make something or add a character or have characters interact in a way that maybe you didn't originally intend to. And what hit me to do with this character is to make him not just from Southern California, not just a real popular geology, a real popular kind of interactive, sort of a more youthful but very bright geology professor, but to make him a very unique ethnic group of Southern California. Now, you could pick almost any country of the world and make somebody that. If you've ever been to L.A., everybody's there. I mean, the 6 years that we lived there, I mean, I ran into people from every corner of the world. You name it. I remember doing 2 or 3 weddings where I actually got to use some Hungarian language. I mean, that's what I'm talking about, how diverse it is. But the one ethnic group that I didn't anticipate running into when I lived in L.A., and I ended up having to, because of where my church was located, were Armenian Americans. Armenians. And as I write in the author notes in the back, the only Armenians I ever even knew about before I moved to Southern California was George Zookmajian, the former governor of California, and Jack Kevorkian. That was pretty much it. I did, but I certainly ran into him, because what happened in the late 1980s and actually before that and into the early 90s, is a lot of Armenians, of course, they've been moving to California since the 1800s, but they came over in different waves. A lot of them from the former Soviet Republic and from Iraq, Iran, Lebanon. They're a diasporic group. If you know anything about Armenian history, they went through some very, very grim times at the end of World War II, middle of World War II, toward the end of it, as the Ottoman Empire was coming down, on the level of what happened, to a great degree, level of what happened to Jews in World War II. It's called the Armenian Genocide, depending on which viewpoint you take. 60 Minutes did a piece on it a few months ago that was just very enlightening about what happened as the Ottoman Empire was disintegrating. And so a lot of them are, were thrown out of their homeland in what is today Turkey, and ended up in all these other countries. And a lot of them ended up in Glendale, California, which is the city where my church was located. And you'd see signs of businesses all over the Armenian language on it. One time I asked our board president, who was the president of the Glendale Chamber of Commerce, I said, what are you guys going to do about all these Armenians moving in and buying up all these businesses and setting up shops? He says, we went to them and asked them to come to one of our meetings and tell us what you plan to do. I mean, that's strong a force. And so if you ever go to L.A. and you go to Glendale, you go to the Los Feliz area of the city of L.A., you go into Burbank, kind of that little zone there is kind of a little Armenian quarter, if you would. And you find this to be the case in L.A. A lot of different, neighborhoods and stuff are strongly like one group or the other. And I remember sitting in my office one day sort of praying, which ministers do sometimes, about how are we going to reach this community? Because it's such a strong community here. I mean, the community around us was changing so much anyway. A lot of the traditional people live there, moving out, and all again, people from other countries moving in. How do you reach them with a unity message? They're not exactly going to walk through the front door, generally speaking. And so a few days after my moment of prayerful thought, these 2 Armenian guys come up to the church and ask me, we have this AA group down at this one club in Glendale, and it's not big enough room. We understand you have a nice big room here with other AA meetings. Can we move in? I said, let me show you. So I got educated about the Armenian community from these guys. They really taught me a lot about it. And I talk a little bit more in my author notes about being introduced to Armenians. So I decided to make my protagonist, my hero of the story, an Armenian American, born in Southern California, but of that background. Okay, so I've got this guy going. He's a university professor. He loves geology. He's a little bit geeky, too. I'd make it a little bit geeky. How do I create some heat in the story? You want to create a little punch. And then it hit me. Why don't you bring a visiting lecturer to the university? And by the way, I made him a professor at Cal State Northridge. Now, if you're going to pick a place for a geologist to be a geology professor teaching geology, Northridge is the place. Because if you were there on January 17, 1994, you didn't sleep real well. 6.7 earthquake. just trashed the place, trashed the campus. You know, the Northridge quake is what it's known as. It's probably one of the most damaging quakes Los Angeles ever had. And it was not a huge quake by, Richter scale standards, but it hit fairly shallow and right directly in an urban area. And it did major damage. It killed over 60 people. It took a long time for them to recover. So I thought, well, make him a Northridge professor. And I knew a guy in the church there in L.A. who was a professor at Northridge. So I was kind of thought of doing that with this guy. So I thought, well, why don't we bring a visiting lecturer over to talk about geology, and why not make it a she, and why not make her from Istanbul?
Brilliant.
All right. So you have an Armenian American and a Turk. Yeah. Heat. But I decided,
Juliet right there.
well, but here's what came to me to do. I'm writing this story about geology and about earthquakes and all this stuff. But why not make the real message of this story something about bringing healing to something like that, a genocide? And why not with people who had nothing to do with it, but that's their ethnic background? Because then, can you really blame her? Is it her fault what happened almost 100 years ago? That's what this book's about. It's about reconciliation. And I do it through these two characters. He's not attached to what happened in the past. He's heard the stories like anybody else who grew up in an Armenian neighborhood, an Armenian family. But he's an American more than he is an Armenian. So he's modern. He's current. He's 30-something. His mother's into this stuff, and his grandfather who came over from, the old country and like that. But he's not into that. And here's this a little bit younger but very bright, very sharp geologist from the Istanbul Seismological Institute. I made that up. It's actually based on a real place, though. It's amazing how you'll think of something and then you'll find it. Did a lot of study of their website, most of it written in Turkish, but, I learned a few Turkish words. I've even put a few in the book. Well, why not put them together somehow? And so I did. And I want to read a little bit of my hero's, a little bit of what he does in a class. His name is Alex Demirjian, or Dr. D, as he's called, because people can't pronounce his last name. So here we are. He's in Live Oak Hall, Cal State University, Northridge. And he says, "Good afternoon, class. Today we're going to discuss seismology. This shouldn't be something that is new to any of you, since we live in this extraordinarily seismologically active part of the earth we call California. Is there anyone here who has not experienced an earthquake?" Not a hand was raised. Didn't think so. Okay, let's get started. A hand shot up from a girl in the back row, catching Professor Demirjian in mid-sentence. Yes, Miss Daniels, isn't it? Yes, Laura Daniels. Came to Foch. Alex scratched his head in disbelief. "I find it amazing that you have never experienced an earthquake. In all my years of teaching this class, no one has ever raised their hand to that question. Just where are you from, Laura Daniels?" "Warsaw." "Warsaw? Poland?" "Indiana." The entire class did what you just did. "All right, I'll grant you that Indiana isn't exactly earthquake country. However, everyone should have already read up on the seismology chapters 16 through 20 of the textbook." Moaning echoed throughout the room. "Well, hopefully this little review will help you with the exam next Thursday." And so he goes into his lecture here. So I won't read you the whole lecture, otherwise you will be probably snoring after a while. Well, maybe not, because this guy's very interactive, keeps it going, back and forth, gets the students talking. And but I am going to read you one little part of it here. As soon as I find it. There we go. Let me throw out another earthquake myth at you. Is there such a thing as earthquake weather? Yeah, I think so. Doesn't it always get kind of hot before a quake? My father always said, when the Santa Anas are blowing, there'll be an earthquake for sure. Dr. D turned his head and glanced toward Richard. Richard is one of the students who's always responding. My father used to say that to me, too. He still does. But if we look at the evidence, earthquakes can happen in all kinds of weather. Let's look at our own Northridge quake in reference to Richard's and my father's weather prediction theory. When did it happen? January 17th, 1994, at 4:30 in the morning. Not a particularly hot month even in Southern California, and the temperature was a nippy 42 degrees Fahrenheit when it hit. Ooh, chilly weather. Dr. D rubbed his hands on his biceps and contorted his face as if he were freezing. Not earthquake weather. Listen, there is no such thing as earthquake weather. When there's an earthquake in Alaska and it's 20 below zero, the local residents don't say to themselves, I knew it, earthquake weather. We can't use weather to predict earthquakes. I really wish there was a foolproof method of anticipating a quake and warning the public, but weather isn't it. Think about it scientifically for a moment. Have you ever been down in a cave, a deep one? On one of my trips back east, I went to Mammoth Cave National Park in Kentucky. And no matter what time of year it is, winter or summer, those caves are a constant 56 degrees. Laura Daniels spoke up. We went down there on vacation a few years ago, and oh my God, we had to wear sweat tops even though it was the middle of July. Well, there's some corroborating evidence for you. Thanks, Laura. My point is that weather only affects the surface of the earth and not so much the subterranean world miles beneath the surface, where earthquakes have their beginnings. So, Dr. D, should I tell my father that earthquake weather is a bunch of crap? Richard, don't bother. My father still doesn't believe me when I tell him, and I've got a PhD in this stuff. He learned about earthquake weather from his grandfather, who brought the idea over from the old country, so it must be right. Better to let them believe in their Santa Claus and Easter Bunny. Does he also say that California is going to fall in the ocean? God, I hope that doesn't happen, said Roxy. I don't know how to swim. Roxy's one of the quick responders to his questions throughout that. So I'm showing you here in this chapter, when you read this chapter, this is where I do a little bit of education about seismology and earthquakes. I don't do it by just giving a whole bunch of prose answers. It's all in the class that they're discussing. So as you read the book there, you're going to get a little feel for the basics of seismology. I'm not a geologist. I had to really bone up on this to write it with any degree of effectiveness. And so how do I get these two together? How do I get this Armenian-American geology professor from Cal State Northridge and this Turkish seismologist lady together? Well, here's how it happens. Dr. Eugene Williamson, chair of the Geological Sciences Department, poked his head in the door. He was having a student discussion with one of his students. He says, we need to talk before the meeting. Sure. Dr. D turned to Brian Jones from his afternoon class. I love to put names of real people in there. Brian Jones, Rolling Stones. He says, keep up the good work, Brian. I'm glad you enjoyed the excursion out to Devil's Punch Bowl. It's a place he likes to take people on excursions. Thanks, Dr. D. See you later. Dr. Williamson took the now vacant seat. Lex, by the way, he's called Lex by his close friends. Lex, I've been looking over everyone's schedules, and, well, you're it. What do you mean I'm it? I want you to host our guest lecturer from Turkey. I was really looking forward to handling her logistics myself, but Jackie didn't tell me about plans she made for us to go to Vegas this weekend. Dr. Carhan's flight arrives at LAX tomorrow at 1 o'clock, and I really need your help, Lex, and everybody else is busy. I'll have a TA cover your classes, and with final exams coming, it shouldn't be that big a deal. Here's her itinerary. Well, Dr. Williamson handed him a folder. Alex glanced at the folder, shook his head. Well, Gene, for you, I'll do it. But you'll owe me big time. It's not that I harbor old country grudges of my forefathers about Turks, but I can hear my mother hassling me the minute she finds out I've been playing tour guide for the old enemy. It's hard to keep a secret in an Armenian neighborhood. Oh, thanks, Lex. I really appreciate your help. The next time you submit a special departmental request, like a research trip to Hawaii, I'll go to bat for you. To study geology, of course. Oh, naturally, yes. I mean, where else can you study rock as it's being made in real time? As usual, Gene, your logic is flawless. Well, just let you know you got my blessings, provided you bring me back a pound of Kona coffee. Deal. Speaking of deal, what's the big deal about you Armenians and the Turks? I know that my grasp of history can be a bit wanting, but I honestly didn't notice any controversy at the conference I attended in Yerevan. You'll recall that's where I first met Dr. Karahan. Did you fight a war against each other? Oh, much worse. The story goes the Ottoman Turks exterminated over 1 million Armenians back in the early 1900s. Before Hitler and the Jews, it was the Turks against the Armenians. At least that's what my grandfather always said. He spent time in an internment camp before coming here. Wow, I didn't realize the extent of the bad blood between you. But all that happened practically 100 years ago. I'm an American born and bred just like you. I certainly don't hold modern Turks responsible for what their grandfathers and great-grandfathers did to my ancestors. I'll treat Dr. Karahan as if she were a member of my own family. You can count on it, Jean. I do appreciate your equanimity. I understand Dr. Karahan is quite a leader in her field at the Istanbul Seismological Institute. Her specialty is earthquake prediction assessment, and she speaks fluent English. That's good because my Turkish is a little rusty. Maybe she can tell us when the Northridge thrust fault is going to shake the campus again. She just might. I'm sure you have a lot to talk about. Thanks again, Lex. You've saved my butt. See you at the meeting. Dr. Williamson glanced at his watch, jumped out of his seat, and sprinted into the hall. Shoot, I've only got 10 minutes to get ready. Bye. Just enough time for me to prep that Hawaii field work presentation. So I get them together kind of by accident. The chair of the department was going to handle it, because he's been working on this project to get her over to the university because he was so impressed when he met her at this conference in Yerevan. By the way, do you know where Yerevan is? Anybody? Yerevan is the capital of the modern-day Republic of Armenia. So he meets a Turk in Armenia and decides to bring her to the university, and he ends up pairing her with his Armenian colleague. What's going to happen? Well, I don't want to read you the whole book. I want you to go and read what will happen. But the book is definitely about reconciling this old issue. It's not a piece of history most Americans know about unless they saw that 60 Minutes presentation or just happen to be a student of history. But I like to weave history into books, and particularly history that is kind of relevant in a way, history that's still active today. I mean, if you go and talk to Armenians who are still stuck in what happened, they're going to give you a viewpoint. You talk to Turks, they're going to say they're making too big a deal out of it. And that's the issue today, is that modern Turkey doesn't really recognize that a genocide happened. Armenians say it did, and it's documented evidence. What do you do with that? I take these two characters, modern-day characters, and all of a sudden, something begins to cook between them in a good way, in a positive way, in a reconciliation kind of way, in a way that sort of gets the issues all out there, and then as the story progresses, they begin to, shall we say, come into balance, come into alignment, come into a something that is believable, solvable. Why do we hold on to all this past stuff? I mean, just look at all the genocides that have happened. I'm not trying to be negative here at a Unity Church, but let's just be honest. There's been some really rough stuff that's happened in our world since humanity came around. I mean, it goes back. And why does it keep happening now? And so I take them not only on a tour. There's a lot of tour guiding stuff in this book in terms of geological sites in California. The two of them, mainly, because he's doing what? He's showing her around to all the cool places from a geologist's point of view. So that's kind of the geeky, nerdy, this is their craft. He takes her to the San Andreas Fault. He takes her to all these places that he loves taking his students. So that's what you get through this book here. I try to interject humor through this book that hopefully works. Humor's tricky, as I found out writing a book about Indiana. Mitch Daniels, forgive me, but I used your last name for the character in my book from Indiana. I did that on purpose. You do that kind of thing. The other thing that goes on in here is there's a criminal investigation. There is a police detective and a sheriff's deputy who get sort of just put together in this book. And the sheriff's detective is an old veteran of the force. You'll read about him. His name is Julius Jackson. And you can kind of think of a Danny Glover sort of, why am I blanking on his name? Samuel L. Jackson kind of a figure. Somebody like that, a veteran, African-American guy from South Central. I was, right about South Central. When I was a minister in California, in L.A., I was a minister there during the L.A. riots. I had to shut the church down for 4 days because of dusk to dawn curfew. I remember calling up our colleague in South Central, calling his answer machine middle of the night during the riots just to leave a little prayerful blessing on there that he would get someday. What do I get but him in the building at 11 o'clock at night answering the phone? Richard Byrd is his name. I said, "What are you doing there, Richard?" "Defending the copy machine." I said, "You're doing what?" He says, "You had to burn the Korean grocery store across the street. They're all around the street like this." I said, "Get in your car and drive home." Of course, for him, driving home was driving home to Compton. Not exactly a step up, but anyway, safer than being where he was. So when I thought about writing a police investigator in this, I thought, well, why not make him from South Central and not LAPD, but Sheriff's Department, LA County Sheriff's Department, because where the crime takes place is not in this. There's a crime that happens in here. Does not happen in the city of Los Angeles, but happens in L.A. County under their jurisdiction. People always write about LAPD. Why not write about L.A. County Sheriff? Of course, I had my own experience at the L.A. County Sheriff Department one time when I was driving home from the Glendale, Locker Center area back to our house in Palmdale. I lived for 5 years in L.A., 57 miles from my church because that's all I could afford to buy a house. I couldn't afford a house around where I lived. I mean, to buy one. I could rent a little lean-to that we were in, but that was it. So we made the big leap, being super commuters. Eventually just wore me out. I mean, 5 years of having 2 jobs, being a minister, you know what that's like, and being the minister's chauffeur, 115 miles a day. It just, it was grueling. And one of my drives home, I was on the Angeles Forest Highway driving home. I decided I didn't want to take the freeway then. You could go through the mountains. It's about the same amount of time, but less miles. And all of a sudden, this LA County Sheriff's Blazer came whipping around a corner. I'm in my lane, and he's in my lane coming at me, and I had to get, there's nowhere to go. It's like, remember, it's in the mountains. And so I tried to weave around to get down. And a few minutes later, he came back and pulled me over and accused me of doing what he had done to me. A couple of young deputies, just full of it. And I had my daughter in her car seat in the back. She was young then. Now she's a Purdue grad student. She was in her. I'd taken her to work. I think you were on a trip somewhere. And they just started at me like a couple of cowboys, just going on about driving over the yellow line and going too fast, which is what they were doing, and accusing me of child endangerment. I mean, they were just going to tea on me. And I said, "That is not what happened." He said, "It'll be our word against yours in court." So, it's like, okay. So they started writing up the ticket. And they wrote up the ticket for crossing the yellow line and doing a 45 and a 55 zone. I guess that was too fast. Anyway, I'm serious. That's what it was. Then the guy, you get to the end of the ticket, and of course traffic is just a mess trying to get around it. The guy looks at me and he says, "What do you do for a living?" Well, there's a $64,000 question, right? I told him I was a minister. Wow. You never saw attitudes change so fast. I mean, they were stuck. They had already written the ticket, called it in, and they're sitting here talking to a minister, who's basically telling them, "You made up this crap, man." Well, the next day they released me. When I got back to work, I contacted the local sheriff station and explained to them what happened. Actually, I wrote them a letter on church stationery and said, "I sure hope this kind of stuff doesn't happen to members of my congregation, because this is just total, I didn't write anything offensive." The captain of the station called me up and they said, "Okay, I've checked it out. The deputies are standing by their story." I said, "Of course they are." What are they going to do, say we lied? He says, "I don't know what to do with this." I said, "I'll tell you what, in California you can do this. I'm going to go to traffic school. I'll pay the $40 and I can have this ticket erased with no record of it ever happening. You can do that in California. I have a buddy out in Southern California who owns 100 different traffic schools all the way from San Diego to Mount Shasta. So you can do it. You do it once a year on tickets. I said, I'll do that, and I'll save us going down to court and having them show up and have to, we'll go through this charade. And he said, oh, it's real nice of you. He says, by the way, for what it's worth, they're no longer working together. It's a little side trip there about the LA County Sheriff's Department. But I decided to make the Sheriff's Department in charge of this investigation. Detective Julius Jackson and a deputy, Robert Chin, Chinese guy. And so they end up kind of working together. I didn't decide to have them start out, kind of like partners, but they end up kind of working to help solve the crime of what happened, which I'm not going to tell you about. Well, actually, there is, if you read the back of the book, it says, while millions of Angelinos, that's people who live in L.A., go about their daily lives unaware of the seismological danger that lurks beneath, Cal Stover, a dedicated geologist from the U.S. Geological Survey, uncovers a threat that could trigger disaster for all. When he is found murdered near a gold mine next to the San Andreas Fault, the police suspect a connection between the mine and his untimely death. Okay, something happens. Front of the book. That dog finds something, doesn't it? Cal's friend and colleague, Alex Demirjian, a local geology professor, and Kiraz Karahan, an alluring lecturer from Istanbul, are unexpectedly thrown together. And through an intuitive sensitivity, she discovers when the fault will slip. Can they save greater Los Angeles from the impending peril? Will Cal's killer be caught? Along the way, Alex and Kiraz experience not only the reconciliation of their ancestral past, but discover one another. So what is The Fault? It's a romance novel that's got geology in it. It's got crime in it, crime investigation, some intrigue, some humorous situations. It's got family scenes in it. It's got a little trip overseas to a certain city. I wonder which one that is. But it's a place where you can actually, well, the city, you talk about divided cities. Cities are divided by something. In Cincinnati, it's divided by, where I come from, it's divided by Vine Street. You're either from the west side or the east side. And people there know it. In this city, you either live in one continent or the other. It's the only city in the world like that. So there is a little international tour aspect to this book. It's got a bad guy. It has a really bad guy. Well, he's not a horrible bad guy, but he's a bad guy. I was told that my other villain in my first book, The Grid, wasn't mean enough, and other people thought he was too mean. And one was, they were both Unity ministers who said that to me after reading it. He's terrible. I'm like, oh, he's not bad, because you can only write a bad villain as you are yourself. But anyway, I think I've pretty much.
You take questions.
Yeah.
Do you have questions anyone who would like to ask him either about writing or about the content up to a point?
Yeah. I mean, the one thing I'll just say right now is that I wish I had the books here to sell. I did everything in my power to get them here in time. This is my complimentary author's copy. I just got it Friday. And I could not order books until I had physically gone through the book to make sure they didn't mess something up. So you can buy the book on Amazon right now at quite a discount. They've marked it down. If you do a lot of buying from them, soft cover is like $12.99. The Kindle, they dropped down to $7.69. So that's available. If you want one autographed by me, I can take pre-orders. It would cost you $15 because of what it costs me to kind of get books without a royalty and then shipped, and I have to pay Indiana state tax and then ship them here and stuff. So I can do that if you want. But either way is fine with me. Anyway, any questions about anything, writing or?
Did you find any faults in the copy of that?
Well, one of the challenges being a writer, being a writer is also being an editor. It is very hard to edit your own stuff. Now, I have an editor-in-chief. She's sitting over there. So having another set of eyes look at it. I don't have quite the resources to go out and hire pick a copy editor who's going to notice stuff that I just, typed wrong. So what I decided to do was to really sweat the details in terms of doing many, many drafts of this book until I got to the point where I was pretty well satisfied it's as perfect as it's going to get. And when you're writing, you use a word processor, Word, what most people use. And then when you send it to the publisher, now I've used Author House, which is a print-on-demand publisher based in Bloomington, Indiana. They've printed 2 of my other books. So I'm used to working with them. And when you send them the manuscript, and you have to send it, it's ideal if you can send it with a lot of formatting stuff that you need to make sure it's, when they change it to a PDF format, which is how they'll send it to you to review, that it works right. And I noticed, and then you really, unless you pay a lot of extra money, you really have one shot to correct stuff. I printed it off in hard copy because there's something about looking at hard copy versus looking at a computer screen that causes mistakes to jump out more easily, where you can see, oh, God, I can't believe I wrote that twice. There was some dialogue with one of the bad guys in the book where I actually wrote what they said twice. I caught it. And there are some formatting things that happened in that conversion from Word to PDF that can be a little tough. And with the book, particularly one with some dialogue, sometimes when you're writing dialogue, you're not writing perfect English, particularly like, go get them. Well, perfect English is go get them. But go get M is an apostrophe EM. And when it converted from Word to PDF, it put the apostrophe the wrong way. It also did it for years. Like the year was 1999. No, the year was 99. Same thing. So I had to go back through the entire manuscript and find where I noticed it, and I found it. It just consistently did it all the way through there. And so when you ask the question, is there a fault in there, I missed one of the apostrophes. And so, oh, God, on a year. And it was the year of a car that somebody's talking about. It was a 96. Well, I'll tell you what it is. You got to look at it like an Amish quilt. When the Amish make a quilt, they put a mistake in it. Because only God is perfect. So that's my Amish quilt thing. I looked at that and I thought, nah. You can find it. Yeah.
I'm going to comment. I will be reading it for a lot of reasons. I don't know when. I was an English teacher, but now my life is so full, I don't read novels anymore. I'm functional illiterate now. But that's but
I wrote this book for those.
I have to read it because I spent 22 years in Southern California. I taught in LA Unified School District.
You did?
My school was in the 1965 Watts riots curfew. I still own property in Lancaster.
You
went
do?
out there 4 years ago to check out the property. It's nothing but a mud hole. It's 2.5 acres.
2 of our kids were born there.
In Lancaster, and I also, I was in the 1971 earthquake, I think.
Sylmar.
Sylmar, exactly.
Not far from Northridge.
And I got my master's at Cal State University, Northridge.
You did?
Yeah, and I don't know if Valentine Hall.
Yep. Yeah.
I don't know if that fell down or not because it wasn't there then. I taught at Granada Hills High School.
Really?
Quite a while.
Well, then if you're from the San Fernando Valley,
yeah.
this is set in the San Fernando Valley.
Yeah, and I knew some Armenians too.
Absolutely.
Bart Krikorian I taught
Yeah.
with. And,
Okay.
Let's see. I don't know. I can't remember the other guy's name, but I taught with these people, so I learned about that, and it's quite a place living in Southern California, and of course, I'm from here and so forth. I've been to Mammoth Cave and all that stuff. So I have to read it. I have to because there's so many little things that you've mentioned that are so right along the familiarity line. So
it's really a book. I mean, in a way, if you're going to think of, who's your target audience? It's definitely people who live in Southern California. This book's about them. It doesn't mean that if you're from Indiana or New York or Germany that you couldn't get something out of it. I mean, it's a story, it's a novel. It's hopefully got some aspects of it that touch you in some way, and that's what you're trying to do. Yeah.
I'm just giving a preview, so I know that it'll be fun to read.
Yeah, I wanted to make it satisfying to read. Is really what I was trying to do, and also to write it in a more modern style. You can't write like Helen McGinnis did back in the 40s and 50s, like that book I originally was reading. Where you have so much prose and detail, and you have to. It's not that there isn't any in this, but you have to keep it moving along. And really, most of that is more in the beginning. And then there's more dialogue that kind of kicks on this. But I try to set up the scene more in the front part of each chapter, and so that you at least have a cursory understanding of the location and what you're looking at there. But try not to overdo it like some writers do. And that's just one of the things that I learned after writing the first novel, where I think I was a little more, wanting to be more like a traditional writer. I mean, today it's just a different world. I'm still behind the learning curve on how people write stuff today. I mean, there are whole novels that get written on iPhones and stuff in Japan or something. I was reading that the other day. I mean, what? Mostly romance stuff, but but it's so I didn't try to drag the end of the story out too much either. When I got to the end of where I felt was the end, I just stopped. And you can figure out what you think happens afterward on your own. But
I'll probably either read it all in one sitting,
yeah,
or else I'll steal 5 minutes here and 5
Yeah.
minutes there. I don't know.
And
what
you can-
I'll-
yeah.
We'll see.
yeah,
But it'll be fun.
yeah.
I have a question about the writing process. Do you get to a point when you're writing, and if so, how do you deal with it, where you're sort of sick of it, or you're frustrated because you run into a difficulty where you don't know quite what to do next or whatever, and you just kind of want to throw the whole thing away? You start to look at it and you say, this isn't very good anyway. Your ego kicks in. I've done this twice. I've written 3 or 4 chapters of something.
Oh, good.
And thrown it away because I get to this point where as soon as I encounter a certain amount of challenge or whatever, I just kind of get sick of it. And I get probably lazy.
Yeah.
And I decide it's not very good, and I get rid of it. Have you ever done that? And how did you get past it? Or maybe you haven't.
Well, I try not to throw things away. I mean, if you do it in your computer,
Well,
it's...
I still have the chapters somewhere.
Yeah, somewhere.
Yeah.
Yeah, don't throw it away, because you never know. There might be something,
Right.
some gold in that.
You just cruise through it and that doesn't happen for you?
No, you hit the writer's block where you kind of go, okay. I mean, being a writer, I learned from a guy who's written probably 50 books. And it's from when I was writing the Bible book. And his name's Roy Eugene Davis. Some of you may be familiar with him from CSA down in Georgia. He's written he was a disciple of Paramahansa Yogananda. He's written countless books on meditation, yoga. And back in more in the 90s, he and I kind of kept up with each other and stuff. And we visited him in Georgia a couple of times. And I asked him one time, I said, I'm trying to be a writer. What advice do you have to give me? And he says, you have to treat it like a job. You decide, I'm going to write between 10 and 4, or whatever you decide whatever your time is. And then you sit down and you start writing. And some days it just flows like crazy. And you're just trying to stay up, your fingers trying to stay up with what's coming through your mind. Some days you sit there and just stare. And nothing comes. And some days you want to take what you wrote and do what you do. So I'm not offering a lot of inspiration or hope to you here. But, it's like with anything, you can get kind of tired of your own stuff. And so you reach kind of okay, what do I do next? You have to go and just do something else. It's like with anything. You just got to go get some air. You got to, maybe back off it a while. I mean, it took me 6 years to write this. I started in 2005. And I allowed another book to get in the way of it that I just had to write. But it was like, if you're given an idea for an article or a book or something like that, then, that's like a divine idea. That's an idea that has a life of its own. And so you have to keep tuning into, well, what is the life of this idea that is expressing through me, and then just run with it. And sometimes it takes the passage of time or some event to kind of kick you into looking at something you hadn't looked at before. And that's what it was with writing all the books that I've written. It's just that the time is right for it. And, one of my friends called me the other day, left a message on my machine. I was outside doing something. It was right after the quake in Virginia. He said, what better timing for your book, man? You need to go hire some publicist who can just blast it all over the place. Last night I just went on Facebook and said, okay, it's live, buy it, or something. You have 420 characters to put in the caption on the link to Amazon or something like that. You write because you enjoy the process. Whether you're writing fiction like this or nonfiction, there's something about putting words, assembling words together to communicate an idea that you like doing. And that's why I write. I'd love for some Hollywood producer to pick up this book and turn it into a made-for-TV movie or, I don't know, something like that. Well, whatever. They'll change everything, I know. And I was fortunate with The Grid, the other book, to have 2 Hollywood producers look at it. One of them is the son of a Unity minister. Billy Blaine, her son Tony, Hollywood guy. The other one, who looked at my book, I actually used what he wrote back in his Dear John letter to put as an endorsement for the book that I had sent him. These endorsements on the front are of all my 3 other books. It's not of this book. I didn't have anything to go out. New York Times says it's the best damn thing ever. No, but you got to use what you got, right? And so it says here, thank you very much for submitting your novel, The Grid. It's certainly a timely subject and on everyone's mind these days. I congratulate you on the creation of it, ... I have the original letter from Sidney Pollack. Not bad. How did I get Sidney Pollack to look at the book? One of my father's old girlfriends. My mother died several years ago. He had girlfriends. Now he's married. But one of his old girlfriends was from South Bend, where Sidney and his brother Bernie grew up next door to her. When she got a hold of that book, read it, she says, it's got to be a movie. I'm going to get a hold of Bernie. I knew Bernie better. Anyway, I had to go hire a lawyer to send the books to Bernie and Sid so that they could review them. And I got back the nicest Dear John letter I've ever got in my life. I've got it hanging on my wall. You just got to keep at it, is what I'm saying. If you got ideas for something you want to communicate, get out there. And today the playing field is much more level than it used to be as a writer, where sending off manuscripts and getting rejection. I did that initially with a lot of my books, and finally I said, the hell with it. Sorry, can I say that here? We've got so many other ways to publish today. So books are just all out there anyway. So anyway, anybody else?
Any other questions? I read it when at the university I went to. There was a guy who was writing a book how to self-publish, and he was printed in the computer lab I was working at. So how do you think about self-publishing?
Well, this is really close to that. This is called print on demand. They don't like print 1,000 books or something. They're printed as they're ordered. So as you go to Amazon or to this Author House website, either way, the sale gets made, the order goes through, it goes email or whatever, I don't know how they do it, gets sent to where the books are printed, they're printed and shipped, you got your book. So there's no having to carry around, boxes of stuff. Unless you're going to go do an author signing, which I didn't show up with much today. So that's what, I think it's unless you have an agent and you're, tell me some of the writers you read. She reads all. Yeah, you got to be one of those guys to really make it big. I'd love this book to sell 1,000 copies. That would be awesome. Most books don't sell 5,000. I'm lucky that my first book sold now over 12. That's really quite remarkable. I didn't think it would do that. But when Unity published that book back then, the publishing department was kind of at a real high point, and They hired a publicist that went out and got me on radio and TV and newspaper interviews, and I was up in Chicago on television. It was really cool. It was back in the late '90s, and since then things have changed. But I was real lucky, and I guess that book really struck a chord with a lot of people. So, yeah.
Which is more fun or interesting or whatever, to write fiction or to write a book like the biblical book?
I don't know. I like writing both. I guess with fiction, what you like is it. And here's why I started writing fiction. I know I'm standing right here. When Wisdom for a Lifetime came out, I was in my church in Cincinnati. I remember that Sunday. It was in April, where I went from being a minister to being an author in my own church. It was a weird day, where I'm out signing books. And I remember, they made the presentation we made the presentation in the church service. And as people were coming out the receiving line, I had some old guy come up to me and he goes, "Well, you got another one in the hopper?" Like if you're a writer, you're constantly writing books. And off the cuff, I just looked at him and I said, "If I ever write another book, it will be a novel so that I don't have to prove anything that's in it." When I wrote that Bible book, you talk about going through a sieve. I had people like Frank Judici reviewing it. This guy was a big Bible teacher at Unity Village. Laura Bennett reviewed it. Editors looking it over with. Copy services department trying to make me prove everything I wrote in there. It was just... And then that book is also heavily referenced. Most Unity books aren't. But this book really had to be. If you're going to be doing Bible study, you got to know where to look for stuff and what I'm quoting and things like that. I had to write 45 letters requesting being able to use various parts of other people's books. Some of them I had to send to India through registered mail, to Great Britain, And you have to at least attempt to get agreement, not necessarily whether you get it or not. And fair use laws, kind of play in there when you're quoting somebody. And so I was exhausted by the time I wrote this book. I wrote the last quarter of the book and did all that in my first year in the ministry in that church. And I was just kind of tired. So I made that comment about if I ever written a book, it would be a novel. I don't have to prove anything. And then the idea for a novel came to me 6 months later. Watch what you say. So the writing process is the same. The difference is that you're writing a fictional story with people you make up, and you're writing dialogue. You really have to think in terms of dialogue when you're writing. You're telling a story as a writer of fiction. And hopefully then you find somebody who will write a screenplay for it, and then they'll show the story.
Period. Thank you so much for what you've offered to us for the lesson today and for the explanation. And we learned a lot more, didn't we?
I hope so.
More applause.
Thank you.